So the reason why somebody is a, quote, people pleaser is because once upon a time, they realized that their worth was determined by somebody liking them. And that probably happened when they were 3 or 7 or 12 or 18 or 22. And then it was just repeated. It wasn't that they were re-traumatized. This is an important note. Okay, you cannot be re-traumatized, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, that's a myth. Okay, there was an original incident, what we call an OI, based on internal family systems therapy and coaching, in which we subscribe to. Once upon a time, there was an OI, or an original incident, okay, that happened. Someone screamed at you because you weren't doing the right thing, right? And that is traumatizing. Okay, and what happens within the nervous system, the body remembers that, and it stays stored inside your body forever until you release it. I often refer to trauma as trauma comes into a tunnel, gets stuck in the tunnel, and needs to be released outside the other tunnel. Most of the time, with most of the people on the planet, it never gets released. It never goes through the entire process. So what we help our clients do is help them release through the other side of the tunnel by first identifying their masculine and feminine wounding, just like I described. Then we have on the other side, Andrew, the what we call integrated or healthy masculine and feminine. So the healthy masculine is leadership and confidence and devotion and power and decisiveness, etc., etc. The healing or integrated feminine, right, is radiance, right, and ideation and creativity and sensuality and arousal. Right? These are all healthy, integrated feminine energies. And when we are possessing both healthy feminine and healthy masculine, now we're on our way to a more healed existence. Does that help?
Definitely. And for you, the listener, if you're thinking about your relationship, it's like, aren't those healthy qualities that David just listed the qualities you want in a relationship, right? There's leadership, there's devotion, there's decisiveness and decision making, and there's also creativity and sensuality and radiance and a spark and a fire. And it's like, but isn't that what we all want, right? Like we want, all of that, right? We want the relationship to be headed in the right direction, for growth to be occurring, for each individual inside the relationship to be pursuing the best version of themselves. And we want that like dynamic between the two, between the partnership, to use that word again, between the couple to say like, okay, what is the, what's unique about this, and where's that spark? And that spark comes from the feminine. So I really love this. And I also want to circle back on this whole trauma informed polarity coaching. So we go back and we identify this trauma, and again, trauma, I don't think we need to spend a ton of time defining it, but your definition, I would love to hear how you define trauma, just so we get that, box check. Because some people say, I've never been traumatized, or whatever, but what's your definition?
Mm-hmm. How we define trauma is any dysregulation to the nervous system. That's it. So falling off your bike when you're 7 is trauma, right? Being screamed at is trauma, right? Now, what's important to note, a little bit of science here. So all the science nerds, listen up. Okay. The nervous system was developed and created before the brain. Okay. So the nervous system was there in utero, right? And experiencing, and by the way, trauma can be passed down generations on a cellular level. Okay. So we can experience trauma from 2 or 3 generations ago and go, why in the world do I feel traumatized? I don't think this ever happened to me. Well, it's because your great-great-grandmother experienced trauma and it was trapped in her cellular system, her nervous system, and was passed through, right? So it explains an enormous amount of, I don't really remember that ever happening to me. So it's the dysregulation of the nervous system. And when the nervous system feels that trauma, it remains there until it's processed and released. That help?
Yeah, that's super helpful. I do need to double click or like push back a little bit on the whole, this can be passed through generations. What's the, is that a belief of yours? Is that scientific? just help me understand, is that through epigenetics or something like that? For the, for someone who hasn't studied this as much as you, that sounds maybe a little bit far fetched, but I'm open to considering it. What would you say to that? To play devil's advocate, right? Because like if you say something like that, someone's going to be like, "What does that mean? How is that possible?" Like, walk me through that.
Yeah. Which, by the way, I love devil's advocate. I love pushing envelopes. That's why, I think that's why, because I see it as an opportunity. I see it as an opportunity to dialogue. In fact, one of our guidelines of engagement at Daring Deeply, our coaching practice, one of our 10 commandments, if you would say, is to be curious before critical, is to ask questions like you're doing. Like, oh, I'm going to double click on that, which I never heard that. That sounds like an Andrew Biggs to me. Well done. I'm going to double click on that. I'm going to backtrack and say, wait a minute. So to answer your question, yes, epigenetics, right, is part of this. And scientifically, what we have seen, I'll give you an example. Mark Waller wrote a book that's called It Didn't Start With You. And his research as a therapist over a generation or so, for example, he tells a story of a woman with whom he was working with, one of his clients, who was having serious suicidal ideation. And her suicidal ideation was very specific. Her family owned an ironworks, and she would fantasize about taking her own life by throwing herself into the hot molten lava. Now, I don't know all the intricacies of all that, but I can imagine. I've seen enough movies where I've seen the giant vat of stuff in an ironworks, and this was very curious. And what she couldn't understand was why that was coming through so often. Like, why that? Why not a, quote, traditional, this could be sounding macabre, but a more traditional way in which to take one's life. Mark, in his therapy, began to identify and move through his therapeutic practice and leveraging some IFS theory, which we can get into a little bit. And what he came to understand, what she came to understand after she did some research, she found out that her grandmother was murdered in Auschwitz in an oven. She was eviscerated, right? And so in some ways, this was her opportunity to release her grandmother's trauma. Now, there was a whole lot more. Once she understood, oh my gosh, I am carrying the trauma of my dead grandmother from 2 or 3 generations ago, she was able to connect and say, oh, now I'm understanding where that's coming from. I'm able to then have those communications with those parts, which is part of internal family systems, parts work, if those of you that are familiar with that. So she was able to have conversations with those parts and begin to release that trauma that had been in the family for who knows how long.